I've done this. I've literally said this most nuanced thing that I prepare for days, and someone will come up with a conspiracy theory, or it's too right, too left, whatever. And that draws me back to God. So, like, if you're anxious about this season, what if God is allowing some of this fractiousness to continue to push the church back into a dependency on Him, not into techniques and procedures that will protect us from pain?
Welcome to the Carey Nieuwhof Leadership Podcast on YouTube. I'm so glad you joined us today. Hey, we are continuing our Pastoring in a Partisan Age series today. Mark Sayers is going to talk about the rise of the culture wars, conspiracy theories, and a whole lot more. We'll get to that in just a moment. But hey, did you know that this month we're celebrating the 10th anniversary of this show? And that's because of you. You guys have been so generous sharing it with your friends. That's how shows grow. And that's why we've been able to do this for 10 years. And to celebrate, we're celebrating you. We're going to give away one of my favorite things. So one of my hobbies is I love grilling and smoking on the Big Green Egg. It's a cult. I am in the Big Green Egg cult. I love it. And here's what we're going to do. We're going to give away one extra large Big Green Egg to a grand prize winner. We're going to give away a lot of accessories and a special steak delivery. And then for two runner-up winners, we've got two Big Green Egg Mini Maxes. These are small versions of the Big Green Egg. They're incredible. You can take them tailgating, take them camping, put them in your backyard, whatever you want to do. So one grand prize, two winners that are runner-ups. Now, how do you enter? Well, if you're in Canada and the US, the contest is open to you. Drop a comment and share a special moment from this podcast, something you really appreciated. And then step 2, enter at cnlp.live. Winners will be chosen on September 26th, and I hope you win. Hey, I want you to know that this podcast is brought to you by my brand new course called The Art of Navigating Church Conflict. On September 23rd, I'm releasing a brand new course that is designed to help you navigate the incredibly explosive and divided culture we're in right now. It's my comprehensive training where you're going to learn to use proven frameworks, strategies, and skills to unite your church, to inspire people, to empower them, and to navigate conflict and mitigate criticism. You can join the waitlist for the course at theartofchurchconflict.com. And check out Convoy of Hope. Whether it's organizing an event or supporting families in need, Convoy of Hope wants to find a way to reignite a love for serving your community through compassion ministry. So to partner with them, go to convoy.org/Carey and start loving your community today. And one note before we get started, purpose of this podcast, yes, we're discussing a lot of things. It is educational and informational. A variety of perspectives are represented throughout this series, so play nice in the comments, keep it civil. We're trying to diffuse conflict, not make it worse. The goal of this series is to help and to diffuse the conflict that the culture is experiencing. And with that in mind, let's go there right now with Mark Sayers. Mark, so good to have you back on the podcast, and thanks for joining us in this series.
Yeah, so excited to be chatting again.
Well, we've had some great conversations, and I want to start here because you have such a good historic perspective and global perspective. In terms of tribalization and division, what is different today than, say, in the 1990s or even 20 years ago?
Well, I think it's a number of things coming together at once is what is driving this. So one thing I would say is that we had 2008 had a global financial crisis, and a lot of today's problems can be really traced back to that and the responses to that. That you saw that affect a lot of working people around the world. It really affected the economic system, and a lot of the solutions to that, from printing money and going into debt, are affecting people today. And I think that's the background story that a lot of people don't talk about. Obviously, COVID and the economic response to COVID was also something which repeated those patterns of printing money. And we've seen things like inflation and so on. And there's an increasing sense that people are struggling to get ahead economically. There's a growing divide between those at the very top. And even since 2020, we've seen just that top 1% grow financially. So anytime you have economic disparity, it just pours fuel on other social disconnection. So I think that's one of the background stories that people are not talking about. And you can see that everywhere from Bangladesh to Boston. The second thing is that we live in a time of our entire way we process information is changed through social media. And social media has brought the world a lot closer. So events that we previously had distance from, such as you'd read the newspaper and read about a flashpoint, it's now on our phones all the time. And it doesn't just present text, it presents faces and voices and emotions. And sadly, one of the things that travels very fast on social media is negative, emotions, anger, frustration. So you put those two things together, growing sense of inequality. And I'd say the third thing is too that, Marshall McLuhan, great Canadian, talked of a global village, which sounds very sort of, lovely. But actually, his interpretation of that is villages can be quite tribal places. They can be violent places and very loud places. And I think we're seeing that too. As the world is becoming connected, we're also becoming disconnected as people find identity and meaning in tribal subgroups. And then lastly, I just would say too, I think we're going through a political crisis, that there is a number of countries around the world that if you had a scale of their political health and 10 was very healthy, people have dropped down several numbers. And particularly that's true in some Western countries, which are not used to that. And all of this is driving a very tribalized environment.
Yeah, the economics hasn't really come up on the series so far. So I'd like to dive into that, right? Because if I remember the terminology correctly, in 2008, we called it quantitative easing, right? We'll just print a whole bunch of money, get some prosperity. You saw probably a V2 of that during COVID, where I know in Canada, the government and in America too, just printed boatloads of money to get people through the crisis. Stock market rebounded. You kind of look at that and go, well, isn't that a good thing? Like, isn't that what happened during the Depression? I mean, the argument is that if Roosevelt hadn't come along in the Depression, it might have, how would we have pulled out of it? And you could also argue the war solved the Depression, Second World War. So in some circles, that's seen as help for the little guy, but the little guy ends up being very frustrated at the end, if I understand you correctly. Can you explain that a little bit more?
Yeah. So one of the things that has happened in the last sort of 10 years or so is there's been a real struggle for economies to become more productive. So my understanding of the Canadian economy is that it struggled to produce and grow during the last 9 years. And this has happened across the world. And then COVID, a lot of people forget, because we're so focused on the medical side of COVID, is it created one of the biggest economic shocks since the Great Depression. We didn't feel that necessarily, because you're right. We started quantitative easing, printing money. But what that has happened, it's almost like we used that solution back in 2008. You can't keep using that solution because you have a flow-on effect of inflation. So a lot of cost of living concerns in the last while have been around inflation. So people who might be less engaged in a moment of cultural polarization, all of a sudden when that burger costs more money, when they can't pay their mortgage payments on their home, everything starts to become more inflamed. And I think you're right to bring out the Great Depression. There's a lot of parallels to what happened in the 30s, where you saw real polarization across the world. The far left, far right rose. And there's another parallel in the 1970s where the world had inflation, low growth, and an oil shock. And again, too, I just have read several histories of the 70s lately, and the parallels are amazing to what's happening now. So I think that economic background is what a lot of people don't talk about when it comes to cultural, polarization and tension. But I think it's one of the big stories. A lot of people feel left behind. And then that drives looking for answers, ideologies, which can explain that story.
When you look at the density of podcast listeners to this show, top 5 cities are all American, but you have LA, Chicago, New York, I think Atlanta and Dallas are the top 5 consistently for listeners of this show. With a couple of exceptions, housing is all but unattainable and unaffordable in those big cities. You think about even in Melbourne, where you are, or near Toronto, where I'm located, housing has just gone bananas. And when you think about that, you're pastoring Red Church. A lot of listeners here are engaged in their local church. You're dealing with a significant now percentage of the population that just can't even meet their bills anymore. It's like rent has gone through the roof. I don't know that I'll ever be able to afford a house. I don't know that I can keep our house. Cars are crazy in terms of expense. And as you say, everybody wants a tip. My wife and I, we went out and we just had burritos, like to-go burritos. And we took them to have, the waterfront and just relax. It was $46 with tax and tip for 2 burritos. And I'm like, what planet am I living on? Like, this is crazy. And so, you think about that. How does that impact you as a pastor, as a local leader, when your people are under that much financial stress?
Well, it definitely changes locality. The idea of that people are going to go through their life journey from, perhaps being a young family to a retiree and do all that in one community. Now, we'd already seen that change happening in people moving around a lot more. But yeah, like Melbourne's housing price is very similar to, what's happened around the world. It's just incredibly unaffordable. And we've seen that, get people come along, you connect, they love your church, and they have to leave, not because of a theological issue or whatever. They just cannot afford to live in the area. And I'd also say too, it's one interesting thing that pastors, I think, need to get their heads around is the fact that there's an inevitable conservative force about buying a home that changes people. And this has been talked about a lot in politics. You, in a sense, have something to conserve, to work towards, but when you don't have that, people become a lot more mobile. There's a greater discouragement about the future. So I see a lot of hopelessness pastorally that, we can never get ahead. Systems rigged against us. What are we meant to do? So it adds a whole new layer that perhaps wasn't there in the past when housing was more affordable, particularly amongst the young.
When you think about the culture wars, Christians seem to have really gotten caught up in the culture wars in our lifetime. I don't know whether it was always so. You can make an argument either way from history. But I'm curious as to why you think that has accelerated. First of all, do you think that's accelerated Christians participating in the culture wars? And if so, why have we become so hypnotized by them, mesmerized by these culture wars that are going on around us?
Yeah. Well, we went through a culture war really after World War II called the Cold War, which had a culture war element between communism and democracy, and that very much shapes the world. You watch a movie like Rambo or Rocky with, where he fights the Soviet fighter. There are also Stallone movies, but, if you go back and watch movies from the 1980s or even 70s, there's this constant theme of culture war between those two political forces. When the world became unipolar, meaning America became the sole power in the world, in a sense, then America got to determine so much of global culture and popular culture, and politics seemed to disappear there, particularly at the fall of the Iron Curtain. And we almost went into this anti-politics or agnostic politics time where people thought that the economy is going to keep growing, the world's going to slide to a sort of utopia, politics is almost over, we don't need to argue about these things. I always think of the show Seinfeld, which was the most popular show, a show about nothing, just their individual lives and little quirks they went through in their day. And all of a sudden, culture wars come back. And I think part of that is because the United States in particular, as the country which shapes the world so much in terms of particularly the English-speaking world, through its popular culture, re-entered into a political battle, really. And that has gone through the whole of the culture. So everything that we had this large, you can imagine like an expanding circle where perhaps in the 90s, politics was spoken about by people who are really interested in politics. But now it's expanded out into everything. So in terms of Christians, one thing I've been fascinated by is just looking at other areas. I remember being on some online conversations around just following some American Muslims and what they were thinking. And it looked exactly the same as some of the battles you'll see in the American Christian church. People were calling each other woke and accusing other people of being white supremacists. And this was in like Muslim chats. It was just fascinating. You look at in Judaism, you've got different parts of Judaism, from liberal Judaism to Orthodox Judaism, which is splitting politically. You see this I remember that when it dawned on me that something big was happening was when I read an article about how the culture war had split the knitting community in America. And
actually knitting quilts and Afghans type stuff.
Yes,
knitting.
Yes.
Holy
knitting,
cow.
and people were like, in 2020, like, what side are you on? And people were like knitting instead of just like a scarf or We would say jumper. People would understand sweater.
Sweater.
Like political statements on them, and like these groups were falling apart. So for me, I think it's less why have Christians been engulfed in it. The bigger question for me is why has so much of culture. Now in Australia, it's not as widespread. I don't feel the culture war is anywhere like it is in other countries. But you see places like Brazil, India, like polarization, Netherlands has gone across the world. But I think a lot is driven by popular culture becoming much more political at every level. And then therefore that begins to overtake, because we live so much in the world now, it's harder to distance yourself from the world. So social media just means we're constantly in an ideological soup.
So that leads me to my next question, which is why has our theology, we've talked particularly in the last 4 years about the crisis in discipleship, right? When COVID hit, everybody kind of looked around, people left the church, people deconverted, people became secular, whatever. And it's like, whoa, we have a crisis in discipleship. What is it about our theology that has left us not as well inoculated from the culture wars as we perhaps hoped we had been? Does that make sense as a question?
Yeah.
Like, why was our theology not more robust that we could see, or that we can see, hey, this isn't gospel. This is culture. Any thoughts on that?
Well, I think almost the subset of theology here is missiology, And I think, part of my approach to ministry has been people like Leslie Newbigin who, were in a outside of the West context, but then came back and applied the principles that we'd learned to communicate the gospel well in different cultural contexts back to the West. And, in missiology, you're always asking the question, at what part am I communicating the gospel, and what part am I living out the kingdom? But also, what are parts of my culture that I'm bringing? So missiology naturally brings a self-examination. What parts of my culture and biases that I don't see, not in some sort of, I know this word bias is used a lot in the culture. I'm more meaning it from a biblical sense, that in a sense that, I'm a fallen, sinful person. So there's going to be things where I'm going to fall short. So how am I doing that? So you're constantly examining your side in missiology. I think what's happening now is there's people who are doing a form of missiology, but it's always of the other side. And part of my analysis is I look what's happening, say, in the culture war. You can look at it and say, well, the other side's bad. They're the ones doing everything wrong. And that may indeed be largely true. But what polarization does is it makes you look at the people across the aisle, but it doesn't look at the overarching dynamic that's happening in society. That's why I say culture war is really the decline of political culture in many countries. But what happens is that often when you are looking across the aisle at your political enemy, you're missing what you're doing wrong. And often also what happens is you're looking for, when it's so emotional, cultural war, and it always touches key issues of identity, meaning, belonging. And often what happens is you get seduced in a cultural war, not by waking up and all of a sudden one day you're your political enemy. The person who's super conservative is not going to wake up one day, oh, I'm a Marxist. I mean, it occasionally happens. The person who's super left is not going to wake up and say, well, I'm a fascist. You more get seduced by the people you've made alliances with against the other side. So the enemy seduces you by coming close, sounding like, so it's actually allies which often compromise us. And I think you need a theology or a missiology where you can examine yourself, stay true. So hear me, I'm not talking about a constant sort of, self-flagellation, but you need to ask the question, hey, I could be getting this wrong. And where have I sort of, my culture has been compromised and is not gospel.
Well, I absolutely love your podcast, the Rebuilders Podcast, one of your podcasts. And you had a series of episodes over the course of this year on conspiracy theories, corruption, elites, etc., that I thought were very eye-opening. I want to start with conspiracy theories. They seem to be as widespread as ever. Can you help us understand why these are so appealing, why they keep spreading? And then I'd love a few pointers on what to do when you as a leader in a local context have someone come up and they're peddling the latest conspiracy theory on you name it.
Yeah. Um, well, a few things. Like conspiracy theories have grown in our time, and a few things about conspiracies. Number one of the things, particularly if you live in a liberal Western democracy, one of the things that you imbibed without realizing is that you can have a significant say over what is happening in the world through voting and engaging the political process. We increasingly live in a world which is globalized, hugely complex, and even some of our elected officials are struggling with the issues that they're facing. So you actually feel very, very disempowered. And I just voted the government in, and these problems are still here. And as that sense of disenfranchisement from the political process, people start to have a story to explain that. This doesn't seem to be changing. This doesn't make a difference. There must be something bigger going on. Now, the other thing that is difficult with conspiracy theories is you can also fall into this binary of going, all conspiracy theories are bad or all conspiracy theories are true. And the reality is, throughout history, there are times when governments don't tell the truth. I'll give a non-controversial example for your audience. When World War II happened, Japanese army attacked all across, the Pacific, Pearl Harbor, the Philippines, Hong Kong, and they bombed the northern city of Darwin in Australia. And actually, the Australian government did not tell the full extent, because it was wartime, of the damage that had been inflicted in Darwin. So the government actually withheld the truth of what was going on, and they saw that as valuable to the propaganda efforts of the Australian army and not to demoralize the Australian people. So there are things that are hidden. Another example, just recently, more evidence came out in the trial that the 9/11 families have put to try and get more evidence of possible Saudi government involvement in 9/11. And there is stuff that is coming out. The British intelligence services have released some videos which show things that people did not know. So there is an element that in that story, because of geopolitical realities, that there was some stuff around 9/11, particularly the Saudi government's involvement, that the American government didn't want to know because of different geopolitical interlinking. Now, that's not the same as some conspiracy theories where people are saying, there was explosives put on every floor and they detonated the 9. So the world is complex, and governments sometimes do not release all of the information. The files on JFK have not been fully released. Donald Trump said he would, got into office, didn't release them. So there's some things that we don't know. And in an individual West where we're told that we're empowered, that drives us insane. So there is an element that sometimes those in power will hold things back. But I think conspiracy theories, where it then moves into a kind of almost religious sense, where it becomes an explanation of the different dynamics that are operating in the world, it becomes an explanation for evil. So all evil that is pertained against me must be because of a hidden cabal out there. So there is this real nuance needed at the moment where I think some of the things, so for example, I think governments have lost some legitimacy. You look at the reasoning given to go into the Iraq War was presented that Iraq had weapons of mass destruction. That was not true, and we know more about that. So I think leaders, walking their way through this, need to recognize when is someone genuinely asking truth to power, and then when is someone entering into almost a religious framework where everything is answered by this worldview that's very rudimentary and very pits us versus a shadowy cabal at the top. But also in a world where, I often tell people to read the book McMafia by Misha Glenny, which is about economic corruption in the world. And there is a lot of conspiracies around economic corruption. So a lot of conspiracies, I actually think, go back to economic corruption versus some ideological group trying to move everything towards their direction.
So what do you do on a pastoral level? Because, people can debate this forever. It starts to infect small groups. It becomes the Q&A you get over coffee. I've been to Red Church, so, you're having a nice flat white at the back. And somebody comes up and says, well, you know what really happened at fill in the blank. How do you approach that on a congregational level when you've got conspiracy theories one way or the other flying around?
Yeah. I think, again, too, it's training people to do what I guess I said in the previous answer, which is to be missiologists, to examine, so, what's the truth in that? What could be wrong? What could we be missing? And I think when you do that, people start to go, so I think a lot of this comes down to discernment. There is going to be a reality, too, where you have to create some firewalls, because there are some people which are zealots about this. And there are, which could be in the past. What I find interesting is in the past, people might have said, I've got this group in my church which is really big into this particular theological, issue. That seems to be disappearing, and it's been replaced by politics in many ways. So I think, there's some points where if it's becoming destructive, so also there's conversations need to happen in the sort of boundaries of how we're encouraged to do that as the Christian church, respect, listening to the other person, an attitude of love and kindness also need to envelop that. But I also just recognize, again, I say I have the privilege in Australia where I think we have an ability to talk around things more. I know many pastors I've spoken to, it's just come like a firestorm through their church, and that will happen sometimes. I recognize I can say that from a place of it being easier for me.
Happy to discuss this with you, and we may get some listener feedback on this, but my approach over the years, and remember, I'm not leading a church day to day, I'm helping church leaders, so I'm not leading this day to day in 2024. But, conspiracy theories have been around for a while. I remember leading through 9/11, and I can picture the people who would come up to me, well, you know what really happened? You know what really happened? Or they're researching some niche issue and they come back and it's like, well, the truth behind that is, and they basically tell me this, and then I would just not comment.
Yeah.
And it would fall to the ground like a thud. And I'd say something like, well, thanks for sharing that, or good to talk to you. And I would just not comment and let it die. And it almost like gave the message that this kind of stuff is not what we're going to major in here. I don't know whether that would fly in this exact current, but I mean, in a large measure, that's what I do on this show. That's what I do in all the comments. I mean, anybody who's been on the internet for 10 minutes knows it's not hard to attract commenters who are in that. And we just kind of let those comments die. If they can become really disruptive, it's like, hey, that's not what we're leading with here. Just so you know, we're going to focus on the gospel. We're going to focus on a different emphasis. What are your thoughts about that in the moment? Good strategy, bad strategy, or outdated? Feel free to,
No, I think it can be a good strategy. I think, again, too, with our Rebuild This podcast, we have some similar things where, time is really important. And, people talk about rabbit holes, and there's, fascinations that people get into. I have my own fascinations about obscure issues, like I'll go down. But I also know that, if I'm at a dinner party, probably people don't want to hear about my exploration of, the political culture of some random country in the 1970s. So you got to learn of when it's appropriate. And so I think it's actually a good one. I think it's a good one for many issues as well today. That just because we have an opinion and we have platforms that enable us to broadcast our opinion, that doesn't always translate into interpersonal relationships in the same way. So I think it's a good approach.
Yeah, and I find if you fan it, you kind of fuel it. And if you let it die, it's like, that's kind of not what we're about here. We're going to focus on reaching people, introducing people to the gospel. You're working really hard on revival right now. You can point them to what God is doing in your midst, et cetera, et cetera. Okay, helpful. There's also, I really appreciated your work on elite power and corruption as well. Clearly, there's corruption around the world. I mean, I've read major corporations have got like they don't call it. Maybe I heard this on your podcast. I can't remember whether it was from a friend, but it was like, we have a director in charge of corruption to make sure that things actually cross borders and, government officials. And part of me in my little, naive bubble that I live in wants to believe that's not true, but it's true. So on the one hand, you can live in denial. It's like none of that stuff is real. On the other hand, you can be like, everybody's corrupt. And, I got a theory about this. And, the elites are always stealing power, et cetera. You should see what happens at the World Economic Forum, et cetera. I would love your thoughts on how to pastor when that becomes an issue for the people you're leading.
Yeah, I think what's happened in many contexts, it's happened globally, it's more intense in some places. I would say the United States is one place where this is more intense, is that suspicion of power and elites has trickled down. So instead of those two large, billionaires who are behind that political campaign in that election, it becomes, well, my pastor, you're part of this, or part of this big story. So there's this innate suspicion around power. I think that there's an element where, I've been in situations where you meet people who have influence, and when you start to understand some things, you realize that, again, there's a lot we don't know. And that's disempowering, but it's not always the worst, if that makes sense. But sadly, that suspicion, hermeneutic of suspicion, if you like, has become part of so many places where I think there's almost a sort of left rejection of power as something which inherently creates a hierarchy. But there's also a conservative rejection of power, that anyone in power now is pushing a secret agenda as well. In Australia and some other countries, we have something called the tall poppy syndrome, where those in leadership must be cut down. So I think, being an Australian, you're just born into a cultural context where power is seen as suspicious. Anyone who has power, must be sort of brought down. And there's an element there, which I think that one way I've seen it, it's really difficult at times, but it creates a humbling dynamic constantly. And it's a thorn in the flesh at times, but I think it also does undermine the potential to go to the opposite extreme, which is to allow power to corrupt you. So what it means is that your authentic self, having to win people over, sit down with people, work through people, see you as an actual human being who's also leading at the same time. I think there's also an invitation in that moment as well, and helping people understand that, leaders are also servants, and leaders are actually here to partner with those that they lead. I think once you get into that sort of posture, it begins to undermine some of those dynamics.
I'm curious about this because you're extremely well read. You watch YouTube videos for a hobby. You read for a hobby. Be curious to know what rabbit hole you're following yourself personally that might bomb at a cocktail party. But, you're right. I take a month off every summer. And that month isn't spent entirely offline, but it's largely offline. And one of the things that always amazes me is, and I don't want to be agnostic about what's happening in the world, or indifferent to what's happening in the world. I believe God has a plan for the world. I believe He loves the world, etc. But it's amazing how much of that steady diet of information and social media has zero bearing on day-to-day life. You can, unless there's some kind of nuclear holocaust or whatever, you can live through an election. You can live through, and that's a privileged position, living in a peaceful country in North America or Australia. But it's amazing how much that stuff gets in your head when you're following it, and how irrelevant it really is if you spend a month or a week largely offline. Any thoughts about healthy amounts of intake, healthy amounts of information versus unhealthy amounts of information?
I think it's like you can eat different kinds of food and it has different calorie levels and health, or it's processed or whatever. And I think part of what this is it is a quantity amount, but it's also a quality issue, if that makes sense. So, for example, there is currently a conflict in Sudan, and it's incredibly tragic. And, it has geopolitical implications, and virtually no one knows about it. The death toll is incredible, and people outside of perhaps the, Sudanese diaspora, there's very few people who are talking about this. So to sit and read, say, a New York Times article, which gets into the history of this conflict, who are the different sides, what's going on, you read that does bring a different emotion than if you're just flicking through memes of, culture war stuff in the election. So for me, one thing I try and do is, I do ingest a lot of content. I often say to people, you don't have to be me. I run a podcast. I'm fascinated by this stuff. But one thing that I do differently is I always go to the macro. What's the big story here? So that's me. But I think, clicking off is really crucial. I think the fact that our phones are constantly in our pocket. Your phone is the business model of your phone is to get you looking at it as much as possible, and getting you angry about politics. One way it can do that, and actually, it's you are like just as oil is a resource, or lithium is a resource that people are trying to pull out of the earth. They're trying to pull your attention out of the earth, and that's sold on your attention to companies, and billions of dollars are made from your attention. So some of the smartest minds are out there trying to get your attention. So, like I was looking at a bunch of stuff the other day, and just having those moments where you switch off, go outside, look at the natural environment you're in. I'm looking at a lot of overseas stuff, and then I walk outside. I'm in Melbourne. I'm in this particular part of Melbourne. There's the hills over there. Here's these trees. They're going to be here in 10 years when these politicians come and go. I think that eternal perspective is really key. The other thing too is that there is a disempowering. I think it was Thomas Kelly in A Testament of Devotion, his book, which talked about that. We actually can't affect as much as we think. So almost you just got to pick one thing that you're going to do. Most of our influence actually is going to be at a local level with the people you meet, walking your kids to school. We have a political influence in the world, but it's actually far less than we think. And realizing that is a humbling thing, but also a freeing thing.
Well, and it's the difference between being outraged at what's happening in a capital city of your country, what's happening in Washington, what's happening in London or something like that, which you probably can't control, versus your neighbor who needs someone to mow their lawn, or a friend who's grieving that really needs someone to come sit with them, right? And I'm not saying you have to completely ignore that. I'd love to know, I've talked to Seth Godin about this. He's coming back on the podcast this fall, which I'm excited for. But he says, choose your sources really, really carefully. Mm-hmm. And I think there's wisdom to that. And, as they say, you're not going to beat the algorithm. And I'm struggling with that too. I'll get sucked into reels, and I'm there for longer than I want to be. And I'm like, man, that force is very, very difficult to defeat. So what are some filters, boundaries, guardrails, guidelines that you have embraced to make sure that your online consumption is more constructive than destructive?
So I listen to podcasts like
Bless you.
the BBC.
Yeah, I know you're recovering from a cold, so I'm really glad that you were able to do this.
So some things that I listen to is like podcasts, like the BBC World Service, which give you an overarching thing. I listen to the news, but then I put it. So I have in my day a time where I'm going to consume the news. And I actually think text is better than reels and memes and all of this. Reading an article where you understand the broadness of a topic. It's also really helpful to get outside of your own country. One of the brilliant things about this time in history is that you can look at news sources from other countries, which I often do, and you begin to realize. So like Indian politics is, very energetic and has the same culture war issues. And, I understand some of them. But it's just interesting sometimes to jump on an Indian newspaper and we'll go, wow, they're all angry about this stuff, but I don't even understand who half these people are. And once you sort of have a distance from it, it gives you perspective back on your own environment that this is what this must look like to outsiders. So I think in terms of sourcing, most news is biased towards a particular direction. It doesn't give you all the information, trying to get as a broad perspective as possible. And then having limits on that. Think about the fact that, my dad, growing up, my dad was always very engaged with the news, and he would wake up, listen to the radio for 20 minutes as he got ready. He'd read the newspaper with his breakfast, and then he would engage with the news during the day. He went to work, he got on the train, and he'd come home at night and watch the 7:00 news, which made him very informed, but there was boundaries around that. He wasn't constantly following things. So I think having your own, we've got to put the boundaries in now. So just having a moment of the day, if you do want to be informed about the world, which I think we should, I still believe, I think it's the Bonhoeffer quote, read the Bible with your newspaper in one hand. I think that's still important to know what to pray in the world, engage with the world, but having limitations around that so that you're not constantly being overwhelmed. I think that's really important.
Yeah, and it's important for people to know, as much as you enjoy this, you are leading a local church that's got services every weekend and people to minister to, et cetera, et cetera. You've mentioned, and we talked about this briefly, the 1930s, the Second World War. I'm wondering if you see parallels to the Second World War. You mentioned Bonhoeffer, the Nazi sympathizers with the evangelical church versus the confessing church. We've heard those allusions made over the last 5 or 10 years. Do you see that at all, or you think, nah, this is a different era?
Yeah. I think there's a difference between what happened at the beginning of the 1930s and what happened at the end of the 1930s. at the beginning of the 1930s, you had, real polarization. There was a sense that liberal democracies were under tremendous pressure. There was the tremendous economic effects of the Great Depression, which is far worse than what we have now. There was, Bolshevik sort of military, militias on the street versus fascist militias in different countries. And that happened in more places than people realize. And there was just a general sense that society was coming undone. Now, what that led to was, some various, fascist regimes in different countries like Italy and Germany. I don't think we're at that stage yet. I think we're earlier on. And, I think as Mark Twain said, history repeats. As it rhymes, but it doesn't repeat. So I think there's dangers where you can learn from it and see some parallels. Are we at the stage where, we're at a Bonhoeffer stage? I don't think so in many Western countries. It's really important. I've sat and spoken to Christians in Iran. And when you hear what it's like to be a Christian in Iran or places like that, or hear from North Koreans who I think are in a Bonhoeffer situation, you begin to realize the difference between where we are as well. And I think one of the difficulties in culture war, there's a term maximalist. Maximalist is taking every position to the extreme view. So people say, we're here. I don't think we're here yet. We need nuance in these particular things. We always need to be vigilant about, where things could go politically, but we also need to be realistic. Yeah. And when you talk to someone from Iran where, they're basically preparing for the fact that, they could go to jail at any moment. And what's the plan when the secret police rock up at your house because you're a pastor? I don't think we're at that stage at all.
Yeah. For those who may not be familiar with Bonhoeffer's history, can you give us the thumbnail on Dietrich Bonhoeffer?
Yeah. Well, Bonhoeffer was part of a group, called the Confessing Church, which realized as fascism and Nazism, rose in Germany, that they had to take a stand as the Nazi state tried to shape the church, particularly the Lutheran Church, towards its ends. And for Bonhoeffer, this took him on a sort of journey that was theological and political, where he was, in Oxford, he was in a sense in safety, but he decided to come back to Germany to serve the Confessing Church and be as a witness to the church. And this led him towards being part of a plot with some other political figures to assassinate Hitler. And this plot then saw him imprisoned. And sadly, he lost his life at the very end of the war and became a martyr. So Bonhoeffer, for a lot of people, provides a example of how do you resist, totalitarian regimes, and how do you stay true to your faith in a moment of totalitarianism.
Yeah, an interesting study. I want to read some more Bonhoeffer this year. Okay, I want to drill down on some very practical do's and don'ts and strategies and tactics that I want to cover with you. But before we leave that, is there any other broad, overarching, philosophical, theological, metaphorical issue that you think is coloring the conversation now that maybe we haven't touched on?
I think that I think what people need to realize is that we're in a political process which is very normal throughout history. I think part of the reasons this moment seems so crazy is we went through an unusual period of history, in the 90s, the 2000s, where the world seemed peaceful and politics, in a sense, seemed over. Francis Fukuyama, the American political scientist, declared the end of history. And what he meant by that is the great struggle for what political system is going to run the world is over, and liberal capitalistic democracy won. And so people have grown up in this really weird time where you could just do church and get as many people in a room, and you didn't have to deal with political issues. And it was more about, what's the car parking situation like? Or, are the seats comfortable? And in a sense, we've just returned to normality. So I think that's really important for people to know. Read about the 14th century, read about the 1930s, read about the 1960s, like the church has always been involved in very politically fractious times. The other thing I was going to say too is I think it's really important that people don't see what's, particularly in the US and some of these elections I think happening, that this is not going to be a rerun of 2016 or 2020. There are new things happening in the world. Politics is fragmenting. I think we're moving from polarization to hyper fragmentation, where it's not going to be two sides versus each other. It's also happening in a world which geopolitics is influencing more and more and more. That's what happens in a country on the other side of the world. So we are moving almost to a Cold War situation in the world where you've got sort of an alliance of NATO, Western countries, sort of positioning themselves increasingly against the sort of axis of Russia, China, Iran, Venezuela, countries like that. So, this is going to shape the elections going forward. They might not seem like they did in the past, and they're actually going to be, I think, more complex. And that level of complexity, I think, is going to create, is going to undermine polarization. So I think polarization is going to be slowly undermined by the complexity in the world.
So what a lot of us grew up in and got used to leading in is a bubble, and it's over.
100%.
It bursts.
100%.
Wow.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, that's sobering, but it's also helpful to know. So in light of all that, Mark, I want to know, what are some do's and don'ts that you would have for pastors leading through this fall and beyond? Because whatever happens, this isn't going away. We're in a different world. What are some do's and don'ts in your mind for leaders on the ground?
Number one is understand your context. I think because we feel like, social media makes the world close, what is the actual realities in your particular context? And you may be blind to them. So, for example, where we are here in Melbourne, there is, a large Chinese population. And one of the real polarization issues has been around politics in China. During the Hong Kong protests, there was posters and you saw protests and different things happening. Now, for a lot of that was a dominant thing in the community where I live. Now, that wasn't on my social media that much because I'm not on Chinese language social media. But for people in this area, that was a very real issue. And so sometimes what I find is that I'll meet people, and even this is true of people in Australia or New Zealand, who are very invested in what's happening in, say, American politics or, who's the VP pick in the American election. And sometimes social media disconnects us from the actual political realities on the ground where you are. So just because social media has seemingly evaporated the distance between where you are, still be very connected to your local community, particularly if you're a pastor, someone living in a community, be connected where you are. I think it's going to be really hard to, I think just being careful of what to speak into and what to not speak into. So what I mean by that is, there's definitely some issues which have a kind of national importance, which you need to speak into. But increasingly, the issues that are going to come across your path, that's just going to come more and more and more. And there's an element where people can fall into a position of having to almost make policy statements on so many different things, to the point where what's your policy statement as a church on, who should be the, elected leader in Venezuela? You know what I mean? Like it gets to the point where you're not necessarily it's not like you're and I think even universities and local governments are struggling with this now of what do you make a comment on something that may be on the other side of the world or an issue that you have little control over. So I think, I don't have an answer. I'm not saying then don't mention anything because there'll be things of national importance, local importance, global. And often I just find praying for things is sometimes better than a statement, if that makes sense. Praying into situations is really, really key. The third thing I would say too is realize your limitations. Again, I just repeat, I love looking at this stuff. I love understanding politics and culture. It's really almost a hobby for me that I get to talk about. You don't have to understand everything like I do. And sometimes I get people like, Mark, how do I understand like everything like you? You don't have to. You're a person who has finite time. You have finite knowledge on these things. Don't be forced into a corner where you have to understand everything. Because the big flash, the issue that people are probably going to be talking about in 2 years, possibly 2 months, is not the issue they're talking about now. The church has got caught in the 24-hour news cycle as well as the whole of society. So I think understanding your limitations and even being honest with people around that, I think is really key going forward. Because let me tell you now, I've spoken to politicians and they don't even understand all of these issues, let alone the local church pastor. So I think free yourself of having to be pastor / political expert, sociological expert on everything. We need to be informed, but the amount of stuff that we have to get our head around is so growing rapidly that I think it's becoming a burden for many people. And that's an expectation which is unfair on a lot of leaders.
I think that's a really good point, Mark. And I wonder if we've seen the pendulum start to swing back in the other direction. There was a period a few years ago where everybody needed a statement on everything. And when an incident happened, you had to post immediately on social media. You had to make some kind of statement, issue a press release. And I've seen a few companies anyway now go, you know what? We make pots and pans. We're not issuing a statement on every event, or we make clothing. That's what we do. We're not going to have a position on every public policy issue. And I wonder if there's wisdom in church leaders. And I don't want people to miss what you said when you said you can pray about it. Like you can pray about the election, but that doesn't mean you have to comment on every aspect of the election, knowing that hopefully you've got people from both sides of the aisle in your aisles, that you've got people from both sides of the spectrum within your community, or all sides of the spectrum from within your community. Any thoughts on that? Are we starting to get a little more like, hey, maybe we don't have to say something on everything, or did I miss something in that?
No, I think you're right. We're seeing that in companies, that increasingly companies are just finding that, it's really difficult. And, as I said, you're never going to miss something. I mean, the example of Sudan I just gave, I've not heard a church make a statement on Sudan. I've heard some church, so the Palestine-Sudan situation is really interesting. There's a lot of, focus on Gaza and Palestine and Israel. Very similar situation happening in Sudan, virtually no commentary. So, there's an element that you're going to miss something eventually. So also, I don't want people to hear me saying, let's be apolitical. I saw a church in a country that's not yours, not mine, where there's been a real national issue. And I just saw on Instagram last night that they're going to call a prayer meeting around that. I thought, brilliant. You need to talk into that. That is a national issue that is contentious, but you need to be praying into that for your nation. Brilliant. But I think having to comment on every single thing, it becomes different. Even politicians are pulling back from that a bit because, it just puts yourself in an impossible position at times. I think one other thing I would say as well, I think we need to understand that you can do this incredibly well and you're still going to get a backlash. I just say this about rebuilders. We really try to go macro on things and we still get backlashes, and we've had people have goes at us and stuff like this. I personally, and speaking through things, with nuance, praying about things, I've still had people come up and rip shreds off me. And I think there is almost like a mentality, particularly for younger leaders who perhaps came of age in that period where politics disappeared. And, you could almost take that all the way up to 2016, I can just do this in the right way and do these 5 things and I'm not going to experience this. I think there's a reality that part of what we're called to do as leaders is that Jesus very clearly said, people against you and it's unpopular. And I think, that's almost something we need to just outline as part of leadership. Leadership is really tough at times. And I think we've done a disservice to many leaders saying, no, it's not. You can do these 7 things and you're going to be really popular. It's simply not. So I think there is a way where this is just part of something. And when that happens, I had a situation which was just really tough around this. And I remember afterwards just like, Lord, and it came at the worst moment. Like I was at a low moment and with a bunch of other stuff going on. And, I just thought, okay, God, I'm not going to get bitter here. I'm not going to get scared. How does this push me back to you? And I think those feeling dread, looking forward to upcoming elections and going, okay, instead of we do need to be wise and there's things we can do. And hopefully there's wisdom in what we've presented here today and what you're presenting in some of this series. But there's a point where we're not good enough to dodge the political bullets on all of this stuff and not be controversial. And you can say this nuanced thing on this. I've done this. I've literally said this most nuanced thing that I prepare for days, and someone will come up with a conspiracy theory or it's too right, too left, whatever. And that draws me back to God. So, like, if you're anxious about this season, what if God is allowing some of this fractiousness to continue to push the church back into a dependency on Him, not into techniques and procedures that will protect us from pain?
Well, let that sink in for a moment. I think that's really good advice. It doesn't always protect us from pain. And there's part of me that really misses that little golden era where we all got a free pass for a few minutes, and we're not there anymore. I'm going to ask you a hypothetical question. And I could say, do this for Australia, but Australia isn't nearly as contentious as the United States is right now, nor is Canada. Any thoughts on whether it's wise to preach a series around the election? I'm not talking about, hey, we're endorsing so-and-so, not so-and-so. I'm not talking that. But like, to what extent would you speak into that beyond prayer? Where is the wisdom in that, knowing that, what you just shared, you're probably going to get in trouble anyway. If you don't speak about it, people are going to be, why aren't you? If you do speak about it, you didn't do it this way or that way. What's your wisdom on speaking into the issues right now as people head into the fall?
Well, the first thing, again, I would fully go into prayerful discernment, number one. Lord, what are you asking us to do here? The second thing I'd ask, context. Like, I think it's true, the US is facing a contentious election. What's your context? I've got friends who are in completely Republican states. I've got friends who are in completely Democrat states or cities or whatever, and others who have absolute fault lines, who've gone through tremendous polarization, division, people leaving over the last little while. So first of all, what's your context? Secondly, what's the context of your leadership? You may be just a pastor with maybe one person on administration, or you could have a whole team. You'd almost need everyone on board if you can do something like this. But I was talking to American pastor just a couple of weeks ago, and he's going to do a series, but he's going to come at it very biblically, because there are resources, books like the Book of Revelation, studying books like that, which sounds like people are like, oh my goodness, you're going to do Revelation during an election series. But there is many things in the scriptures where I think Paul and the rise of the New Testament are struggling with this. They were in a very political environment with the Roman Empire. And I think there is resources in Scripture. So I would come at it very biblically as well. You almost have to get people out of, don't come at almost front. This is if I was going to do it, don't come at frontally, like we're going to explore these issues. Go, in the first century, this is what they were facing and this is what they learned. This perhaps relates to us today. So I think at the end of the day, bringing people back to the Word, to Scriptures, to understanding how people throughout history have approached these things, to realize that, we're not the only ones who've gone through this. The people of God have faced these things before, and often even more intense things before. I would talk to people outside of your own context. Interview someone on video. I was watching a video of some Christians in Lebanon who are doing some prayer initiatives, and what Lebanon has gone through. Oh my goodness! When you think of polarization, civil war, the Beirut, port blast, you start listening to that and go, what am I worrying about? In comparison to what they're going through, and people still live their lives. Like in a sense, but Lebanon's gone through the utter nightmare that many of us fear could happen, and people still go to the supermarket and people meet in church, and just hearing those stories outside of your context, and perhaps people in other contexts have dealt with things politically, could be helpful as well. So I think it could be a wise thing, but you really want to pray about it, think through it, discern it, and make it biblical.
I think there are some pastors who are afraid of their congregation. They remember what happened in 2020, 2016. They've tried whatever. They got bitten. They really prayed about it. They were as nuanced as they could be. What advice do you have? And you've certainly taken your share of criticism, both outside and inside your church. What advice do you have for pastors who might feel afraid of their congregation or the reaction of their congregation?
Well, fear, and I don't say this, as you just explained, I've lived this. Fear is a fantastic field for the enemy to plant seeds. And, fear has a corrosive effect on leadership. People are drawn to leaders who have confidence and boldness and go forward with courage. We follow those who are brave. But also there can be foolhardiness as well, and braveness without wisdom and discernment. I think we have to say goodbye to the myth that did develop in the church during that golden period, that if we just do some focus groups and, again, have nice lighting, have nice seats and car parking, that we can get a large group in a room, and that's the goal. At the end of the day, I think we are living in more fractious times, and there's going to be people who leave and get offended no matter what you do. That's what I realized. And also, I've had the other experience where you so prepare for something and you nuance it, and then person A over here reacts to something completely different and ridiculous. And I could never have thought of that. This is how did this happen? So, I do think that at the end of the day, we have to realize that we're being called to preach God's word, to partner with God as his kingdom advances in the world, to bring people to Jesus. And we're not going to do that just pleasing everyone. We're just going to create a sort of, anodyne, beige Christianity that the world is not looking for. Can I just a really interesting stat that came out of Australia, and I don't think America is here at all if you're hearing this, but I just found this fascinating that recently we were told that Australians' trust in institutions had plummeted. But to our complete shock, one institution that had gone up was the church, because people are becoming so disillusioned with all the institutions of society. They're like, I know you church guys, you're a bit strange, but we're going to give you a try because everything else is falling over. People need to hear there is more of those people than people realize out there. There is something happening. It's happening in Australia. It's happening in Britain. It's happening in Europe. I think it's going to start happening in the US more, where people are just going, I don't know what to believe anymore. Like there is there was a lot of talk about deconstruction in the church. What a lot of people don't realize is there's deconstruction happening of the society. Secularism needs society to operate in a particular way to promise us the ability to live without God. There are many people outside of the church deconstructing society. So yes, people are going to be annoyed by some things you may say in church. But there's probably going to be another group of people who rock up and want to hear the message of Jesus. And there's an evangelistic opening happening at this moment that we also need to be aware of as well. So you may lose some cultural Christians and pick up some brilliant converts.
That leads me into what I think is my final question for you, Mark, which is, what opportunities does this present for the church? I mean, as fractious and difficult as it is, as nuanced as it is, and everything we talked about for the last hour, there's an opportunity here. What is it?
So two things. So number one, I really have been studying the 30s and the 1970s as parallel moments. And after the war, and then in the beginning of the 1980s, there was just this sense that people seemed to get exhausted by the polarization. And they were just done. They couldn't do it anymore, particularly in the early 80s. So there is a natural end to some of this stuff. I just wanted to say that. And there's a point where people go, okay, I'm done. Let's start to build. We're at a time of tearing down, but a time of building comes after. And so I think people need to prepare for what comes out of this. Yes, you need to weather the storm, but there will be a time of social building after this. Secondly, so much of this is tribalization is driven by the death of community and connection in the West. We're going to see increasingly people looking for community and connection, and we are brilliant at doing that. The church is great at doing community. And you may not feel that, but, there's so many people that have no one to talk to. The idea of just go to a small group every week, or whatever you call them, growth group, Bible study, that's going to become incredibly attractive to a lot of people to be in community. So be aware of that. And thirdly, I really do believe that there's a growing amount of people. Nick Cave, was a musician. I grew up from Melbourne, the post-punk artist. I remember watching him. He'd come, as a young guy, we have this video.
Nick Cave and the Bad Seeds?
Nick Cave and the Bad Seeds.
About? Yeah, yes. You're kidding. Oh, wow.
He would come on and he had this song. I remember looking as a kid, I just sort of was getting serious about my faith, and it seemed so dark, and he had no shirt on. He was on heroin. It was like, the absolute opposite to something which felt holy. And, after the death of his son, he is sort of, inching towards the church, turning up in church. There's something here. You're seeing many intellectuals starting to just pivot towards church. Dawkins has not got faith. He's talking about being a cultural Christian. This is really unexpected. I think the more...
Sorry, I missed that. Dawkins is talking about what?
Yeah, Dawkins is, sort of being describing himself as a cultural Christian. He's saying maybe there is utility to some of these things. You're hearing people begin to talk like this, and this has been happening a lot, particularly in Britain. There's been people having it, but we're seeing it on the streets of people who, when no one's listening, start to want to talk to you about faith because they've got serious questions. The more people that do psychedelic drugs, the more people that push into crazy stuff, that has some super negative stuff, and I don't want people doing that stuff. But it also means that people start to become spiritually open. In the tumults of the 60s, and when a lot of that stuff happened, there was also the Jesus People movement that began. And I think we're going to start to see stuff like that. One of my great sayings is, crisis precedes renewal. So the more things that go into crisis, the less people look to the idols and ideologies of the world. And I think it was George Hunter who said, look, if you want to look for an evangelistic opening, look for the gap between idols. When people's belief in one idol fails and before they've jumped onto the next one, there's this moment of openness. And I think that's happening now. So, be aware of the opportunities in this moment. It's more chaotic. It's often more painful, but there's serious opportunities. I mean, the other way I would just picture it, I think that golden period was also a rubbish period. Because I got sick of trying to lead people who just wanted comfort. And, I think now we have an honest, real, I just, have seen this year traveling around my nation, a growing hunger for God, for people who are just like, man, things are bad. We've got to press into God. So that's an opportunity we need to be aware of. And in a sense, just turn down the volume on some of the social noise. And what's the signal in the midst of all of that? That actually there's an openness to God. People need God. The church is built for moments like this. Let's take advantage of the opportunities.
Mark, every time we talk, I feel like I'm seeing the present more clearly and I'm getting insight into the future. And this has been so helpful. You do a lot. You've written numerous books. You have a great podcast in Rebuilders. You preach on a weekly basis at your church. If there was a place you would direct people to learn more, where would you send them?
Yeah, you can go to my website, marksayers.co, and you can check out different social media stuff there. Yeah, check out Rebuilders. I've got a new book coming out in 2025 called Platforms to Pillars. There's some great places to start.
Well, this won't be our last conversation, Mark. Thanks for being part of our series, and thank you for all you do. You really help me find clarity and make me think about things that honestly I never would think about without you. So thank you for that gift.
Oh, thank you so much. I always love these chats.